Well, good morning. If you notice this morning, we are not in the book of Habakkuk. We will return to Habakkuk next week. But I honestly felt that just, for everything going on in our COVID-crazed world and in the recent life of our church, that we could really use some time to just bask in the affection-warming, soul-soothing truths of Psalm chapter 34. We have many reasons to be thankful today. Yet before we turn to our psalm, I actually want to open our time leading into it with a question. And it's a really important question. Who's the true hero of your life story? Who's the true hero of your life story? Just think about it. When you remember the darkest and most bitter moments of your life, or the greatest successes and victories in your life, when you remember those events, when you talk about those events, who's the hero? That time when your marriage was almost over. For others, when you were trapped in the soul-crushing darkness of depression. For others, when you were locked in long-standing patterns of addiction, whether that be to alcohol, drugs, or pornography. You're trapped. You couldn't get out. You look back at a time in your life, and you were just reveling in the cesspools of sin. Or you were so utterly broken by the death of your spouse, the death of a child, or the death of a loved one that you weren't really sure that life was even worth living yourself. We've all been through very dark times in our lives. We've also had very high peaks where we've seen incredible things in our life. But the question is when you tell the story, who's the hero? Are you the hero? Are you the one that clawed out by the sheer force of your will and your wit and your wisdom, and you're just smarter and stronger and harder than everybody else around you? Or is there something far greater going on? God's work on your behalf for His glory. See, if you're a Christian, it really matters, number one, that you tell the story of your life. For all the private people I meet in church who never want to tell the story of their life and what God has done, and they keep everything locked away in a little closet or a big closet or maybe a couple storage units, no matter what you've been through. You keep it kind of locked away and nobody ever gets to look in. It's important that you tell your story, and it really matters, number two, how you tell your story. And what we see in the text today is that Thanksgiving is one of the primary ways, not the day of Thanksgiving where we eat turkey, or as I found out recently, somebody turned the day into something called Snacksgiving. They gave up on their turkey. No, Thanksgiving in what we actually do, what we actually say, and what we actually proclaim. Thanksgiving is one of the primary ways that God's people magnify His faithfulness and at the same time motivate the faithful to rightly fear Him. That's the main idea of the message this morning. This is simply this. Thanksgiving magnifies God's faithfulness, and it motivates the faithful to rightly fear Him. Notice the main point, two pieces, and that's because our text today is really two pieces. Verses 1 through 10, verses 11 through 22. In the first half, we see Thanksgiving magnifies God's faithfulness to His people. Verses 11 through 22, Thanksgiving motivates the faithful to rightly fear Him. And we're going to spend most of our time in verses 1 through 10 this morning with just a little bit of time at the end in the final verses. So let's turn to verses 1 through 3 and begin to dive into this and see how thanksgiving really magnifies God's faithfulness to his people. Starting in verse 1. David says this, I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul makes its boast in the Lord. Let the humble hear and be glad. Oh, magnify the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name together. Now, and that's pretty clear when we begin this psalm that David is he's just bubbling over. He's just overflowing with thanksgiving and praise to God. I mean, it's just oozing out of every pore in his body. And even more, he not only wants his daily life to be defined by this celebration of God's goodness, he's inviting everybody around him to join in the celebration as well. He's calling everybody in. See, he's not content to worship God and to give thanks to God and to praise God in isolation. He feels compelled to draw his audience into heartfelt praise and thanksgiving towards God. In fact, if we just look at the first 3 lines, listen to how David is even just speaking. I will bless the Lord once in a while, occasionally. Once a year on Thanksgiving. No, I will bless the Lord at all times. Second stanza, his praise will continually be in my mouth. And then we get to verse 2, and when he says that I'm going to boast in the Lord, the word boast there in the Hebrew is in a certain Hebrew form that emphasizes his commitment to perpetually over and over and over and over and over again boast in God, not boast in himself. See, David is so astounded and overtaken by God's goodness and grace that he wants his life to be marked by unceasing praise and worship. But it's not just a private experience. It's not just a private experience. It's directed towards his friends that they might magnify the Lord with him. Now, there's certain words we can move across and not think deeply about, but this word magnify, we just need to stop and pause on for a second. When David says, let us magnify the Lord with me. What's he saying? See, there's 2 ways we can magnify things, right? And I know we've brought this up over the past couple years, a time or two, but every time we come here, it's worth our time to pause. We can magnify with a microscope or we can magnify with a telescope, right? When we magnify with the telescope, what are we doing? We are taking something that is incredibly small and we're trying to make it look big, right? That's what we do with a microscope. Magnify the Lord together with me. Now, when we're magnifying God, are we coming with a microscope to look at an infinitely small God who has no abilities and no power that we need to bring something to it to actually see something worthy of our affections? Good, I'm seeing some people going, no, Mark. Right? But then we have the other way to magnify. It's a telescope. And we use a telescope to take things that are up in the night sky that are so small, flickers of light, and some things that we can't even see with the naked eye. They don't even cause us to fall to our knees in awe and wonder. They're nothing significant. Yet what happens when we turn the telescope there, or we get like the big Hubble Space Telescope, or any other new telescope that they can look out into space, and what do we see? Amazing things. Amazing things. That in the busyness of our everyday life, do nothing to move our affections, nothing to instill awe and wonder. That's the kind of magnification that David has in mind here. See, Thanksgiving is so important. Telling our story in which God is the hero is so important because for most people, they have no reason to even contemplate God in terms of worthiness and might. They don't. They don't see that kind of power. So Thanksgiving is one of the ways that we show God to be true for who he is. And it also helps other people see who he truly is. Let's go to verse 4 through 7. David says this. It's testimony time. He's going to share his story. I sought the Lord, and he answered me, and he delivered me from all my fears. Those who look to him are radiant, and their faces shall never be ashamed. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all of his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him, and he delivers them. Now in this paragraph that we're in the Psalm, I think it's most interesting what these verses say and what they don't say. See, on the one hand, David goes out of his way to emphasize his utter neediness, his overwhelming terror, and his inescapable trouble. David's saying there's no way out. He's at its wit's end. And yet in his neediness, what does David say he did? He says, and I prayed. And I prayed to God for deliverance. And what did God do? God delivered me from all of my fears. Yet at the same time, in these 4 verses, David does not give us any detail about what God did. Doesn't give us any details about his need or how God delivered him. And I think he's doing this for at least 2 reasons. Number 1, David is pointing us to the true source of our success and deliverance. Even though many times, Christian, we play a small part in it. There's 2 pieces. See, David may not have recorded the historical circumstances of his terror and his deliverance in the body of the psalm, but as we had read to us before the sermon, David actually tells us about the circumstances. He gave it to us in the title of David when he changed his behavior before Abimelech so that he drove him out and he went away. So let's just take a minute to go 1 Samuel chapter 21, starting in verse 10, and let's go actually look at what happened and bring the event into the psalm so we can understand what David's telling us. Starting in verse 10. It's a familiar story for David, and David rose and fled that day from Saul. Kind of like most of David's life, right? David rose and fled from Saul, and he went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, "Is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing to one another of him in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands and David his 10,000s." They know who David is. David's got some street cred. And David took these words to heart and was much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them and pretended to be insane in their hands and made marks on the doors of the gate and let his spittle run down his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, "Behold, you see the man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madman that you should have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house?" Chapter 22, verse 1, David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. See, there's a good lesson here for Bible reading. It is that we don't always get all of the details in every instance. Narrative tells us a story, but it doesn't give us everything. See, the narrative in 1 Samuel doesn't tell us anything about David's prayer, nor does it indicate God's work on David's behalf. If you read 1 Samuel, in this instance, it just looks like David was clever and got out. by the sheer force of his will and creativity, David could be telling the story where he's the middle, where he's the center, where he's the hero. But that's not what David says. When David has an opportunity to recount the story of his deliverance in Psalm chapter 34, he does everything in his power to not show his strength or his wisdom or his smarts, but to show his utter despondency and his desperate petition to God, and says that underneath it all, God is the true hero of this story. The only reason that I escaped, it was because God was at work. In much the same vein as Paul closes out Romans 11 and says, "For from him and through him," speaking of God, "and to him are all things, so that he might receive the glory." David's pointing to God. Number two, David is writing the psalm in such a way that God's people of any age and every age, speaking not just of oldness, but of across time and history, can rightfully appropriate this psalm for their own praise, for their own thanksgiving, and for their own worship. Psalm 34 is written for you as a template. Psalm 34 is written for you as an outline to fill in the blanks. See, when we left Alaska to attend seminary in 2013, we loaded all of our earthly belongings that we had into a 24-foot trailer. If it didn't fit, it didn't go. And then we dragged that trailer 4,600 miles, starting from Homer, where we got off the ferry from Kodiak, all the way to Minneapolis, Minnesota. Now, 4,600 miles is a long road trip, right, families? One of the things, of many things that we did to stay busy during that time, Colleen, Tyler, and I, was to pull out a little book out of the back seat called Bananagrams. Familiar? Little stories, open them up. Somebody sits with the book, and what do? Hey, give me an adjective. Give me a verb. Give me some nouns. And they're filling in the blanks while we're randomly giving the most random, bizarre things we can possibly think of. And sometimes the stories are hilarious, and sometimes they're utterly nonsensical. Right? But that's the whole point. See, David is doing this for us in this psalm, but not where it's silly and not where it's nonsensical. He's saying, let me show you how to do this, because I know we all struggle to do this well. Fill in your story. This is how we do it. And this is how you do it in such a way where God is always the hero of your story. Because let's be honest, as Christians, we're still humans. And we're very tempted to steal the limelight from God when it comes to telling the story of our life, when it comes to answering the question, how did you escape that period of time that you're in? How did you attain the position in which you're at now? And very often we tell it in a way that puts the focus on us. Sure, we talk about God, but God's kind of like off in that corner and he's just getting a little clip of the light when he's really the center. We know that God deserves all the praise and all the worship. We know it. But we just excel at telling the story in a way in which we're in the center. And what we want to do is learn something that is not natural to us as humans. To be able to share God's work in our life in a way that our neighbors and our friends can truly see his glory. Just like the first time you see one of those like crazy nebulas out in the distant galaxies that the Hubble Space Telescope took years to finally pull together and turn into a picture, and you see it and you're just amazed. That's what our stories ought be doing as we share God's work in our life. Because they don't see God that way. So what does David want this to accomplish? Where does he want it to go? Let's go to verses 8 through 10. What's his goal? David says, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who takes refuge in him. Fear the Lord, you his saints, for those who fear him have no lack. The young lions suffer want and hunger, but those who seek the Lord lack no good thing. What do we see as we get to these verses is that David's ultimate goal in this psalm of thanksgiving isn't merely to speak accurately about God, nor just simply to emphasize his works of deliverance. And it's not merely that people might join him in God-centered praise. Those are all true. But those aren't merely what he's trying to accomplish. His goal is that his audience will actually anchor their hope in God and rightly respond to him in reverent fear. He wants it to land on them in such a way that it changes them. See, verses 8 and verses 9 are imperatives. They're commands. He's gone from proclamation to calling people to respond to what's been revealed. Verse 8 is a pursuit, and verse 9 is a disposition. Regarding the pursuit in verse 8, have you ever noticed the word order? Taste and see that the Lord is good, not see then taste that the Lord is good. We often try to, begin on the side where we're kind of like processing everything and visualizing it, where David's just kind of like dive in. If you've ever traveled overseas, you get to taste a lot of things that you probably never would have tasted. And sometimes you see that they were good, sometimes you see that they weren't good. But you don't get to judge them by their looks because you have to eat them out of hospitality. But here, this isn't nearly about hospitality, but he's just saying, by experience, come and find out that God is good. That's what he's calling us to do. And he's calling these people in because it's very well true that many of them may have never experienced God's kindness, and they've never experienced God's provision in answered prayer. And you know why they've never experienced it? Because they've never asked in the first place. They've never asked in the first place. And countless Christians live a life where prayer is almost unknown in their day-to-day life, and especially when it comes to the difficulties in their life. James 4, 2 through 3. James says, you desire and you don't have, so you murder, you covet and you can't obtain, so you fight and quarrel. Here it's this: you do not have because you do not ask, and you ask and you don't receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions. I shared an excerpt from one of John Piper's sermons in a recent theology study we're doing on Wednesday nights on prayer. I'd like to just share a couple excerpts from what he said in this in this sermon on this passage. He highlights this and he says this: James doesn't say, God already knows what you need, and since he's sovereign, you don't need to pray. That's not what he says, is it? He doesn't say God is sovereign. He already knows what you need, therefore you don't need to pray. In fact, Piper goes on to say this verse doesn't mean the exact opposite of what it says. It says you don't have because you don't ask. It's causal. And what this means, as we think about how God works, in our universe and in our lives. It means that God has ordained a world in which prayer causes things to come into being that would not be if we did not pray. You have not because you ask not. And if you go, well, how does that fit with a high view of God's sovereignty? My encouragement would be to go back and look very carefully at your Bible. And also, if you wanted a little bit more, you could go to the Westminster Confession itself that holds a very high view of God's sovereignty and yet affirms the very same thing. See, don't miss this. What this means when we think about God's response to our prayers and his work in our life is that the sovereign God who planned all things according to the counsel of his will before the first Adam existed in the universe, ordained a world in which our prayers are mysteriously enfolded into God's causality, in which he reigns and rules the universe. And he does it in such a way that he always receives the glory. You see where David is taking his audience? He's taking them deep into a relationship with God. Not one that's merely external, that's focused on all the outside stuff. He's pulling them in deeply. He's saying, pray in faith. Taste and see that the Lord is good. I mean, he goes on to say, moreover, blessed is the man who doesn't take his refuge in personal wisdom, who doesn't take his refuge in riches, who doesn't take his refuge in power. No, blessed is the man who takes his refuge in God. Yet when it comes time for protection, when it comes time to deal with all of the difficult things in our life, no matter how dark, how deep, how brutal of a situation that we're struggling, we normally resort initially to our own strength and our own power and our own abilities and our own wisdom. And in it, we start spiraling down and down and down and down into darkness and into depression, because as we do that, what do we see? We think through every possible route that's out in front of us, and some of you are excellent at this. You walk down 500,000 different paths in your mind as you lay awake at night, during the day, during the times where you're making coffee, vacuuming the floor, driving to work. All these things are constantly playing. You're walking down that path, failure, walking down that path, failure, walking down that path, failure. And you walk down it's like everything's failure out in front of you no matter what you try. Yet in that there's also a gift. It's God saying, you don't have this. Turn to me. Find your answers in me. Blessed is the man who takes his refuge in him. Blessed is the man or woman, if we kind of think in the terms of what we've seen in Habakkuk, who falls to their knees in empty-handed faith in the midst of trials, in the midst of false accusations, in the midst of calamity, and says, God, I have no good thing apart from you. I have no way to fix what's broken. I don't. I have no way to right what's wrong, but nonetheless, I'm going to trust you, and I'm going to look to you, and I'm going to wait on you. Because I know there's no way to come out of this without your work. See, Christian, this is where we experience God's goodness. Though in each instance, it always looks a little different, doesn't it? And some of you, I think many of you know this. For some of us, it means sustaining grace in the moment. It doesn't mean that God pulls us out of the storm. It means that God sustains us in the storm. It means that we don't get blown over and we don't get sunk in the storm. The storm still rages. It rages for quite a long time. Yet God does not let us drown. For others, it means deliverance from the storm. It means God pulls you out. God takes you to safety. And a million different ways in between those two poles that God works. Yet at the same time, He's working in each and every one. See, this is where David wants us to get. Parents, you know what your kids need? They need to hear about God's victory in your life. They don't merely need a list of things that God calls us to do as Christians to walk in obedience. They don't need morality alone. They need to hear stories of God's work in your life. They need to hear how you couldn't do it, how you were destined and you were going to fall apart. And yet in His grace, God stepped in as you prayed and you waited and you waited and you waited. And some of you can share stories of waiting, not for days, not for months, but for years. They need to hear that. They need to know that God is worthy, He's trustworthy, and He's more than powerful to do anything. Those are the things that are going to warm their affections for God. And where does this take us? It takes us to a disposition. From taste and see to that the Lord is good, to fear the Lord, O you His saints. And those seem like they don't really belong together, right? Taste and see that the Lord is good. Fear the Lord. So let's press in to this second exhortation. Fear the Lord, O you His saints. Because we really need to ask the question, what does it mean to fear the Lord? And I think in the modern church, a lot of people want to kind of like pedal back from all the fear of the Lord conversation that happens in the Bible. God is love. Why fear? Perfect love casts out fear. Well, it does. But then what do we do with all the commands to fear the Lord? So let's kind of push into this a little bit. So let's begin with what it does not mean to fear the Lord. The fear of the Lord does not mean cowering anxiously in the corner and quietly tiptoeing around lest we accidentally stir up God's petty, irrational, overbearing, and ruthless wrath. That is not the fear of the Lord. In fact, that is not who our God is. And I say this because you need to understand that God is not like the abusive father. The abusive father who pours out all of his personal frustrations, his failures, and his self-hatred on his children when they step out of line because he has nowhere else to go with it. And it grieves me that some of you probably grew up in those houses. Whether it was a father, whether it was a mother, you were the one who took the brunt of their personal problems. And that's not the fear of the Lord. See, fearing God is not a negative experience for those who love God. Fearing God is not a negative experience for those who love. It's a kind of deeply satisfying, trembling, and sweet humility and submission that rises in the presence of absolute power and holiness in God. That's what the kind of fear is that David is talking about here. I'm going to grab 4 passages. We're going to kind of quickly move through them, because the fear of the Lord throughout the Bible, especially the Old Testament, is not a negative thing. Nehemiah 1:11. Nehemiah praying to God, Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight to fear your name. There's delight in it. It's positive, and give success to your servant today and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. And this man he's talking about is the king. Delighting to fear in his name. Psalm 103, verse 4. But with you there is forgiveness. Now, what's the purpose? What's the purpose? He says, that you might be feared. Now, that's normally not the relationship that we think. Like forgiveness so that you might be feared. I would normally think, in my personal mind, would be actually go to God seeking forgiveness because you fear him. But that he might be feared, forgiveness leads us to the fear, not negative. Exodus 20:20, Moses said to the Lord, do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, and that you might not sin. Testing in the wilderness. To fear God, and again, we're not talking negative cowering, but what's the result of it? It's that they're going to walk in obedience. And we get to Psalm 111, verse 10, and David says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Do you want to walk in wisdom, Christian? Do you want to know how right decisions are made? It begins with the fear of the Lord. All those who practice it have good understanding. His praise endures forever. So let me try to clarify this a little bit with an illustration. It's imperfect because we're talking about God on one hand, and then we're talking about human illustrations on the other, okay? So when my girls were little, we adopted a dog. Our dog's name was Snickers, and our dog Snickers was a full-on herding machine. Half Australian Shepherd, half Blue Heeler. If you know dogs, you instantly know what our dog was like. Smart, fast, loyal, friendly. That was our dog. And it's like in the house and out in the yard. I mean, our girls could lay on this dog. They could crawl over him. They could grab his mouth. They could take food out of his mouth. He'd endure almost any abuse at their hands. And then they'd go outside. They'd be playing out in the yard, and something instantly changed when they'd turn their backs and run. Second, they turned their backs and ran away from him, and he was like a lightning bolt after them, growling a little bit, sometimes nipping. We had to deal with that. But in everything he was doing, what was he trying to do? Turn the kids back to him. He just wanted to play more. He just wanted to have a good time. But that herding instinct kicked in, and he went every time they ran. But every time to push them back in. Not to push them away, not to hurt them. See, when we think about the fear of the Lord, in this imperfect illustration here, it means that God's holiness and his perfection and his power doesn't cause us to turn away from him in fear. It doesn't drive us away from God. What it actually does is it actually presses us in even more. It causes us to know that the safest place to be is as close to be as I can be with God. The most protected place I can be, the most satisfying place I can be, the most joyful place I can be is close before the very face of God. And the most dangerous way is to be running away. Not because God is mean. But I'm just not seeking my own good. The fear of the Lord is a good thing. It causes us to delight in God. It presses us ever deeper into his all-satisfying grasp. And the whole purpose, David is in his first half is using praise and thanksgiving and adoration, telling his story in such a way that the people around him will find that in God, that they will be satisfied in God, not satisfied with the things of this world, not running off into rebellion, but they're going to find that their greatest hope, their greatest joy and in life is going to be in a close relationship with God. And he could have ended here. But instead, he drills even deeper into the benefits of fearing the Lord. He drills even deeper in the second half of the psalm. And as you're probably looking at your watch going, wow, how are we going to cover the second half of the psalm? I just want to highlight. I just want to simply highlight the argument that's going on here and a few notes of implications. Because thanksgiving motivates the faithful to rightfully fear him. That's the entire second half of the psalm. So let's go to David's goal in the second half really quick as we're wrapping up. David says, "Come, O children, listen to me, and I'll teach you the fear of the Lord. What man is there who desires life and who loves many days that he might see good?" See, David wants us to know what it really looks like when God's people live in reverent fear and the promises that flow from such a life where they live in the fear of the Lord. And he wants us to know it's a good life. I mean, just listen, like what man is there who desires life and loves many days that he might see good? And I think we all go, I'm in. Right? I'm in. Okay? And we've already seen that God delivers and he's praiseworthy and he's powerful. So David moves to the second half. It's a good life. How do we get to this good life? He says, fear the Lord. Fear the Lord, but live it out in the messiness of our community. In fact, as we look at David's argument in this, I'm just going to quickly lay it out. There's one overarching exhortation that's firmly grounded in two promises when it comes to the fear of the Lord. And I'm just going to summarize them for the sake of our time this morning. Verses 13 and 14. Do you want many days? Do you want to see good? Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. Turn away from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. See, the exhortation in the second half, I want to rephrase it in all positive terms. David is saying that the fear of the Lord is most clearly seen when God's people speak the truth to one another, do good to one another, and pursue peace with one another. That's how it's lived out. What does the fear of the Lord look like? How's it lived out and expressed? Fear of the Lord is not merely something vertical before God, but it's horizontal in community with one another. And it's anchored in two promises. Just kind of grabbing verses 15 through 18, I'll simply say it this way. God hears the cry of the righteous, but he hates the wicked. Why should we pursue the fear of the Lord? Why should we live in the way that he's calling us to? God hears the cry of the righteous. Do you want God to hear you? This is important, please. Number 2, the second promise in verses 19 through 22. He says, even though the righteous will endure many afflictions, they will ultimately be delivered, whereas the wicked will be utterly condemned. Do you notice the encouragement there? David is looking even more long-term. He's looking long-term. And he's saying, Christian, do you know you need to know that you are going to endure affliction. Many are the afflictions of the righteous. Many. And we need to understand that. We don't want it to be that way, but it is the way. David is he's telling us even here. But it's not the kind of an affliction that can separate us from the love of God. According to David, it's the very means by which we actually experience the very love of God and his deliverance, and we see his power at work. See, Olympic, this is what it looks like when God's people are fearing the Lord. It's a good life, and it's a blessed life, and it's a gift from God's own hand. Well, now if we look at it in the terms of David's crazy escape plan, we also see it's something that involves us as well. It's not like God is working and we're not doing anything. Because we saw back in 1 Samuel, we saw everything that David did, yet David is praying and giving all the glory for God for it working out. And in this call to live in community together, there's a peace that belongs to us, and there's a peace that belongs to God. Paul puts it this way in Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 through 13. Therefore, my beloved, as you've always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you both to will and to work his good pleasure. God is at work in the willing, God is at work in the doing, but we are also involved in the willing and the doing. See, this is how the church of God of any age lives at peace and preserves and perseveres in times of division-inducing difficulty by the power of the Holy Spirit. They live in the fear of the Lord, begging God to intervene. Begging God to intervene on their behalf, while at the same time pursuing all the things that are good and right and holy and just in God's sight. That's what David is saying. Yet as Christians, as we close, I want to make sure that we never forget that these are only our promises in Jesus Christ. We don't get them by doing stuff. We don't ever put God into a position where he's induced to respond to our ever imperfect attempts at obedience. We can never put God over the barrel. We can never make God do what we want him to do. Because we got to be honest that on our best days, our attitudes and behaviors are little more than filthy rags, because they're always mixed to some extent with our sin. They're never pure. Left to ourselves, we deserve nothing but wrath, and that's not something to be ashamed of, but to just see the glory of the gospel and the work of God in Jesus Christ. It's here to awaken faith. Why can we come as we come? Not merely because we're fearing or doing or even proclaiming the works of God, but that we stand by faith in the sacrificial death of Jesus Christ. We are declared righteous in God's sight, not by works of righteousness, which we've done, but according to his mercy, he saved us. And it's that very same mercy by which he'll deliver us when he does deliver us. Jesus is the one who came and died for us when we were dead in our sins. He's the one who delivered us from the kingdom of darkness and brought us into his own kingdom. He's the one whom we are counted righteous in God's sight through faith, not our own righteous living. And he's the one by whom we find forgiveness and grace in our time of failure, in our time of need, in our time of desperation, and we find it when? As we confidently approach his throne of grace. because we know that He's promised to never leave us or forsake us. Friends, if you're in Jesus Christ, Jesus is the hero of every stage of your story. Every stage. And He's the hero at every stage of our church's story as well. In fact, when it comes down to it, our story isn't ultimately about us. It's God's means of magnifying His worth through us, so that everyone can see the true magnitude of His worth in all things. And as we as a church and a people and as a nation struggle through our present trial, this is my fervent prayer. My fervent prayer is that we won't merely survive this time, especially thinking of Olympic. I don't want us to merely survive this time that we're in, but by God's grace, for us to thrive by the power of the Holy Spirit in such a way that years from now, when people talk about this time, you and I will joyfully look back in our lives and we'll have the words of Psalm 34. Magnify the Lord with me. Let us exalt His name together. Let me tell you a story. This poor man, this poor woman, this family, this church cried out to the Lord, and He heard them and He saved them from all their troubles. Taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man, blessed is the woman, blessed is the family, blessed is the church who takes refuge in Him. Let's close in prayer. Father, I just lift up your people to you today.